Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is World's End. Now, World's End is Volume 8 of the Sandman series. Now, the Sandman is a dark fantasy comic book series written by Neil Gaiman and published by Vertigo, which is an imprint of DC Comics. Now, this series was originally published in single magazine form between the years 1989 and 1996. Then later on, all the issues of the series were collected into 10 volumes. Now, there were 3 more Sandman books after the initial run. Now, the whole concept of this series is, what if when we dream we're actually going into another dimension known as the Dreamin', and the series follows a character known as Morpheus, who is the king of this other dimension. Now, World's End, kinda like Volume 3, Dream Country, or Volume 6, Fables and Reflections, is actually a collection of standalone stories that just happen to take place in the Sandman universe. But what separates this from those is this one has a wraparound story that ties all the stories together. And the graphic novel is ultimately sort of a modernization of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Like, it's done very much in the same style as that book. Now, this edition of World's End comes with an introduction from Stephen King, which I think is really interesting because I actually do think there are some thematic similarities between the Sandman series and Stephen King's Dark Tower series, because both series are ultimately love letters to the art of storytelling, and they're ultimately stories about stories. And the whole concept of a story within the story, which Gaiman very much plays around with in this book, you see Stephen King do that a lot in the Dark Tower novels. And both series venture off into the genre of metafiction. King kind of takes the metafiction stuff one step further in the Dark Tower novels, but in the Sandman series, Gaiman does do some subtle metafiction stuff. Now, Morpheus actually has a relatively small part to play in this particular volume of the series, but to be honest, that's actually something I really like about this series, how the series is not just about him, it's also about the people he affects and the lives he affects. The basic plot of this volume is there's an event happening called a reality storm, where basically time and space is getting all wonky, and the line between dreams and reality is starting to blur. Now, the book follows a group of characters, both human and otherwise, from different times and even different dimensions, who get caught up in this reality storm, and they end up at this inn called the World's End Inn, which doesn't really exist in any one particular time or one particular world. Rather, it seems to exist in all times and all worlds at once. And while waiting out this reality storm, the characters decide to pass the time by telling stories. And each time a character tells a story, the book opens up into the story that character is telling. Now, you're not sure how many of these stories, are actually canon. You're not sure how many of them actually happened in the universe of this series, or how many of them are just being made up by these characters. But a big factor in this series is this idea that all stories have a certain truth to them, and the Dreamin' is a place where stories come to life. Now, the second story in this book definitely seems to have actually happened to the character telling it, because the events of the second story are directly referenced in Book 9, The Kindly Ones. And Gaiman very much plays around with genre in this book, where the stories within the story range from several different genres, including horror, comedy, drama, high fantasy, and even political satire. Another thing that's really cool about this is each story is illustrated by a different artist, so it's really cool seeing how different artists interpret Neil Gaiman's material, and you see a whole wide range of artwork within this comic. Another thing that really works about this is the wraparound story. The frame story is just as important and just as vital a story as the stories contained within. Like, something you'll notice in a lot of anthology movies, or anthology books, or anthology comics is usually the frame story is just there to be a frame story. It's just there to sort of contain all the stories within, and there's not really a serious devotion to character development. Whereas in here, even in the wraparound story, there's some really hardcore characterization. Now, the two main characters of the wraparound story are these humans named Brett and Charlene from modern-day America who get caught up in the reality storm and end up at the world's end. And both of them are very complex characters, especially Charlene, and what happens to her at the end of this comic is honestly pretty heartbreaking. I do think it's pretty hilarious how the two main characters are normal humans who end up at this inn filled with supernatural creatures like centaurs and werewolves and fairies and other humans, but other humans from different time periods. And yet they don't really make a big deal out of it. I guess you're supposed to assume that because the line between dreams and reality is becoming warped, their perceptions are becoming warped, and so they're not freaking out as much as maybe they should be. But yeah, this overall volume is amazing, and is a great addition to this series. Now, I am going to do little short reviews on each of the individual stories within this book, but before I do that, I want to cut to a short review that my friend Mark Allan Gunnells did on this book.
Hello. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short video review of the Sandman collection, World's End. World's End is actually one of my favorites of the story arcs from Sandman. And calling it a story arc is a little of a misnomer because it's not really one cohesive story all the way through. It's actually more like a short story collection with a framing device around it to tie everything together. World's End, the plot basically is all these different people who are trapped together in this inn during a storm, and to pass the time they start telling stories to one another. And the bulk of the collection is the different stories that the people are telling. And what I really like about this particular collection is that it is very much a story about the art of storytelling. There are stories being told within stories, and then stories within stories within stories, and then a much wider story that encompasses all of this. That is a fascinating structure, and one that I think Gaiman handles particularly well. The stories told here are all very unique. They vary in tone, subject matter, genre, even the visual style that the artists use. They're all interesting, they're all exciting, but I really think the brilliance of this particular collection is that overall structure of the weaving of the stories within the stories so that he can actually make a comment on the art of storytelling itself. I just think it's phenomenal and is a masterpiece. Actually, one of the stories in here, Golden Boy, got its own little spin-off. Not written by Gaiman, but it did continue on in comics form. But I definitely highly recommend World's End. I think it is a fabulous story arc in the Sandman series.
I hope you guys enjoyed Mark's take on this book, and now on to my reviews on each of the individual stories in this book. So, the first of the stories in here, which is told by an old man at the inn, is called A Tale of Two Cities, which is obviously taken its title from the Charles Dickens novel. However, the story itself is more of a tribute to H.P. Lovecraft. The plot of this story is it's about a man who lives in an unspecified city, and he wakes up one day in a strange part of the city where he seems to be the only one around. Eventually, he does meet other people who have also ended up in this part of the city, and eventually it's determined that somehow the city is alive, but it's sleeping, and he has wandered into the dreams of the city. But sort of the Lovecraftian horror of this story comes from the idea that, okay, if the city is alive and dreaming, what happens when it wakes up? Now, while the story is meant as a tribute to H.P. Lovecraft, the whole concept of a city being alive and having a consciousness is a very Clive Barker-esque idea, in my opinion. Actually, my friend Mark Allan Gunnells, who you just saw the short review from, he did a short story called The Support Group from a short story collection he did called Flowers in the Dumpster that had a very similar idea, the idea of cities having human personalities, and that particular story was actually based on a Clive Barker painting. But this was a really interesting and unique horror story, not even so much as part of the Sandman mythology, but this really could have worked as its own standalone story, and Morpheus does make a brief appearance in this story. Now, somebody else that's waiting out the reality storm at the World's End Inn is a character named Clerigan. I hope I'm saying this character's name right, who we were actually introduced to in this series before. He first appeared in Sandman Book 4, Season of Mist. And he is actually a fairy from a dimension filled with fairies and elves and trolls and other supernatural creatures. And he tells a story of something that happened to him shortly before getting caught up in the reality storm. Basically, in the story, Clerigan is sent by the Queen of the Fairy to this city, which is almost like a cross between Imperial Rome and medieval Europe. Now, the city seems to be occupied by humans, however, this is clearly not a city on Earth, or at least not our version of Earth. But the city is ruled over by this corrupt leader who resembles a pope, and he claims to have authority over the afterlife and who gets into heaven after they die. It turns out that there's a political conflict going on in this city, and Clerigan is sent there to represent the interests of the fairy in this political struggle. At a certain point, Clerigan gets captured and locked up, but he ends up getting freed by Morpheus, and after getting freed, he starts a rebellion in the city against the ruler. But this is a really good story. Now, the story is primarily a fantasy adventure, however, there are some horror elements, especially towards the end, and the comeuppance of the main villain is like something straight out of an EC comic. Somebody else who finds themselves at the World's End Inn is a character named Jim, who's actually a sailor from the year 1914. And Jim tells the third story, which is called Hobbes Leviathan. And this story features a character named Hobbes, who we were actually introduced to in this series before. Hobbes is an immortal who is granted immortality by Morpheus. In the story, Jim meets Hobbes, who accompanies his crew on this voyage. And while on the voyage, Jim and two other shipmates find this Indian man who's stowing away on the ship, and the captain is about to have him locked up when Hobbes comes to this man's defense. Now, it's very much implied that this stowaway, based on a story that he tells Jim and Hobbes, is actually an immortal, much like Hobbes is. There's also a sea monster that shows up in this story, and Jim is the only one who really seems to be talking about this after they see it. It's like the other members of the crew don't really want to talk about it after seeing this thing. That's really all I want to say about this story, but let's just say that gender ends up being a major theme in this story, especially when it's revealed that Jim is not all he claims to be. But this story was pretty good. Now, the fourth story featured in this book, which is probably my favorite, is The Golden Boy. Now, this one is actually based on a comic book series that DC did back in the 70s called Prez, which was created by Joe Simon and Jerry Grandinetti. This story also features a few cameo appearances from a superhero called Wildcat, who was originally created by Bill Finger and Erwin Hassan. This story is set on a parallel Earth where in the 1970s, due to a change in the law, teenagers are now allowed to run for president, and a 19-year-old kid named Prez Rickard becomes America's first teenaged president. And what nobody was expecting is that this kid basically becomes the greatest president we ever had. Like, he solves the energy crisis. Keep in mind, the story's taken place in the 70s, obviously an alternate 1970s, but he solves problems in the Middle East. He basically ends the arms race. And he starts focusing more on, like, social justice and cleaning up pollution. Now, throughout the story, Prez is being haunted by somebody who calls himself Boss Smiley, who has a smiley face for a head. Now, this character was in the older Prez comics, but I think in the older comics, he's just supposed to be some corrupt businessman who happens to have a smiley face for a head, whereas here it appears that Boss Smiley is some kind of a demon, and Smiley is trying to tempt Prez into working for him. Now, throughout the story, there are a lot of parallels between Prez's story and the story of Christ. And Boss Smiley basically ends up representing Satan in the story. But this story was a great political satire. I mean, obviously the premise is ridiculous, but Gaiman handles this premise very well, and there are some really funny moments in the story, like at one point, and this is before Prez becomes president, but he's actually visited by Richard Nixon. Like, Richard Nixon just visits him in his room in the middle of the night. But there are some interesting real-life parallels in this story. Like, at one point, there's an assassination attempt on Prez by this crazy woman who's only trying to kill him to impress the superhero Wildcat. And this little subplot in the story is obviously sort of Gaiman's parody on John Hinckley's assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in order to impress Jodie Foster. This story also has some homages to Alan Moore's Watchmen, like the whole smiley face motif. Now, you can read this story separately from the Sandman series. However, Morpheus and Morpheus's sister, Death, both appear in this story. But once again, The Golden Boy was an excellent piece of political satire. The fifth and final story contained within this book is called Cerements. I hope I'm saying that word right. Knowing me, I'm probably not. This story is interesting because it's almost a shorter version of what the entirety of World's End actually is. It's basically a small collection of different stories with a wraparound story that ties them all together. But this story is told from the point of view of a young man named Peter Fax, who would actually later get his own spin-off series. And he is from a city that is devoted to the practice of burial, and his teacher gives him an assignment to attend what is known as an air burial. And while attending this burial, his masters start telling stories, so you get stories within this story. And in one of these stories within the story, you get an appearance from Morpheus's brother Destruction and his brother Destiny. Now, what the stories told within are interesting, but overall, I would say that Cerements is probably my least favorite section of this book. But yeah, that was my review on World's End by Neil Gaiman, and bye.